Hello, I hope that you are doing well. I wanted to jump on and address today a question that I have conversation with Staff Parish Relations Committee and local churches and with pastors about all year. But especially as we are in the United Methodist Church, what we call appointment season, this is a much more common question and discussion to have, and it is, what does part-time ministry mean? What does that look like? Now, I want to start off by saying that I am of the firm belief that whether you are full-time or part-time, ministry is not and should not be a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week job. Ministry is a calling, and in many ways, it's different than an hourly job that you might clock in for. And in some ways, it's not a whole lot different than some other jobs where you might be on call, or there might be ways that you are dealing with tangible tasks or emotional tasks from your work in times when you're not kind of on the clock, as it were. And maybe in some ways, ministry is even more different than that. But one of my seminary professors, Dr. Stanley Hauerwas, he said that we should, as clergy, he was a layperson, he said that as clergy, we should resist the urge and the temptation to become a quivering mass of availability. So I just want to say, starting out, I firmly believe that we should not be, whatever the type of appointment or pastoral role we are, clergy should not be a quivering mass of availability, and it is unreasonable and unhealthy, and I think counter to our theology and understanding of God and God's relationship with humanity, for congregations to expect a pastor to be working all the time. Specifically, as it relates to part-time ministry, sometimes when we talk about part-time ministry, and I'm going to give a little bit more shape to what that looks like in a minute, people will say, but of course we know there's no such thing as part-time ministry. So friends, I want to suggest, for the purpose of this video and your reflection, I want to suggest that perhaps some ways that we might understand that statement are untrue and unhelpful. Sometimes when people say that, I ask them, what do you mean? And there might be ways when we talk about kind of ministry as a calling that we might be able to use that phrase in a way that's helpful. But if by there's no such thing as part-time ministry, we mean that it's reasonable for a congregation to expect, or for a pastor to function as if to function 40 hours or more a week when they're getting paid to only work 10, that is not healthy. It's not healthy for the pastor. It's not healthy for the congregation. It's not helpful for the pastor that's going to follow after. So let's talk about part-time ministry. What does it look like to have a healthy understanding of what that means? So a full-time job in the United States generally means 40 hours a week. And even if the lines around that get a little bit blurry, and we understand that clergy are, as you would in many other settings, call exempt, like if you were in a standard work environment, clergy would be exempt, that you don't hit 40 hours and you're done. But this should be about what we're looking for pastoral roles to look at. So I want to set that as a standard, because when we talk about part-times, it matters what part of what time. Okay, so we'll start with the default of about 40 hours. Okay, so in the Baltimore Washington Conference, when we talk about part-time, we're generally thinking in 25% increments. And so to say part-time means something less than 100%. And so when somebody says part-time, you've got to ask, what do you mean? The most common types of part-time appointments that we have are 25% and 50%. And those are the ones that I'm going to focus on in this video. We do sometimes have 75%. They're complicated for reasons that have to do with benefits, requirements, and they most frequently, 75% appointments most frequently are done when we know we can pair a 25% with a 75 and create hundreds. But I'm not going to talk about 75% today. So 25% and 50%. So if we start with the understanding that by full-time we mean about 40 to 45, 50 hours a week, then half-time or 50% would be about 20 to 25 hours a week, and quarter time would be about 10 to 12, 10 to 15 hours a week. When I talk with staff parish relations committees or SPRCs, the way that I explain it is that you should be planning towards about 10 hours for a quarter time, planning towards about 20 hours, understanding that some weeks go over. So let's try to think about what that means. So think about 40 hours a week as a pie chart. Now again, keep in mind, this pie chart is not all the waking hours of the pastor's life. It is their working hours. So if we were looking at a 40%, so a pie chart as a circle, if we were looking at full-time, it would be completely filled in. All of the working hours would be, would be working for the church. A half-time pastor would be half of a circle, right? And a quarter-time pastor would be 1/4 of the circle. So if you think about a full-time pastor, all the things that they're doing, it makes logical sense, doesn't it? That a half-time pastor is doing less and a quarter-time pastor is doing less than that. Now, the first thing I want to say is that doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing that all of that less than or that less than full-time is covered because they're doing fewer tasks. Generally, our part-time, quarter-time, half-time churches are some of our smaller congregations. And so some of the responsibilities that have to do with the quantity of people or the quantity of responsibility is just naturally smaller and less at smaller churches. So a prime example of this would be pastoral care. If you're in a church that has 150 people and you're a full-time pastor, you're going to have probably a lot more pastoral care visits, people in the hospital, counseling. Just the quantity, because of the size of the congregation, is going to be larger and require more time. If you're in a church that has a 25% pastor, you may have 15, 20 people in your church. There's going to be a lot less of pastoral care. It's going to require a lot less time. So some of the part-time, the 25% or 50%, kind of is naturally evidenced in the needs of the congregation. Because some of a pastor's work does depend on the size of the congregation, as well as the complexity of the ministry. Not always, but often larger churches have more ministries, more interactions, maybe a preschool. So there's just more stuff that requires the pastor's attention. But there are even more ways that a staff parish relations committee, congregation, and pastor need to be mindful about what part-time looks like. I had the opportunity for about 10 months in my ministry to serve quarter time while my family was moving because of a shift in my husband's job that didn't quite line up with the appointment season. And we had small children, and it was important to me to be with my family. And so I served and had a wonderful time in that time, serving 25%. And it was very helpful, both as I thought of my own boundaries, as my district superintendent at the time, Evan Young, who helped me think through what some of those healthy boundaries looked like different in 25% as opposed to 100%. And the congregation helped think through what healthy boundaries look like. So whether a pastor is appointed 25%, 50%, or 100%, they are expected to be preaching and leading worship every Sunday. That's a standard. If you're 25%, it doesn't mean you're only leading one out of every 4 Sundays a month. So preaching and leading worship. And so think about what that means in terms of the pastor's time to prepare for a sermon, as well as preaching on Sunday. So if you think about hours, if your church only has one service, or if a church only has one service, let's say the worship service itself takes an hour to an hour and a half. Probably the pastor's getting there a little bit early. Let's add half an hour to the beginning. So we're maybe at around 2 hours, and they're gonna maybe hang around for a little bit afterwards, just for worship, no Sunday school. So they've got to 2.5, 3 hours just showing up. In many cases, there might be expectations around fellowship time afterwards, and maybe even a Sunday school class that they're expected to attend or participate in. But think about the time that went into preparing the pastor's sermon. Now, as a district superintendent and as a clergy person, I never want to say that a pastor's time preparing their sermon is a set number of hours, because everybody's a little bit different. And part of the role of the pastor in setting their boundaries is figuring out how much time they need to designate to prepare their sermon. That is part of their work time. Now, it's important to think creatively about that. There have been times in my ministry where I have been really pressed by responsibilities, and I found it helpful to use preaching resources and tools to reduce the amount of time that I needed to spend starting from scratch on a sermon. So using a sermon series from some of the tools that are available. But let's say 3 hours. Let's round Sunday morning off to 3 hours. And let's say your pastor is taking 3 hours to write a sermon. That's actually pretty quick to write a sermon. 3 to 5 hours, some might take more. So if your pastor is 25%, you have gone through half of their time, at least, a little bit more actually, just for Sunday morning, for preparation and for preaching. Add on worship planning. Is the pastor the one that chooses sermons and hymns, and how is all of that done? So a pastor can easily get to 6-7 hours a week. So think about that. If your pastor's quarter time, it means maybe they have 3 hours, generously 3 hours, to do anything else in a given week. So think about the ways that your church does administrative meetings or ministry meetings. Many smaller churches, not exclusively smaller churches, but many churches have moved to a one board model that has a lot of benefits. It doesn't work in every setting, but one of the benefits is it allows the pastor to streamline their work, to reduce the number of hours that they're having to devote to meetings in a given week. But let's say you're a pastor, you've got worship. Let's say you've spent 6 or 7 hours, and you have one meeting. Now, maybe you're really fortunate and that one meeting takes 1 hour. Well, now you're at 7 or 8 hours. That means that you've got 2 hours left to do anything else. Leading a Bible study? Well, leading a Bible study, just showing up, could take most of the rest of that time, let alone preparing for a Bible study. How many visits? What's the pastoral care expectation that pastors have? Some pastors like to think of their schedule rotating. So when I was part-time, I didn't have meetings every week. And so some weeks that I didn't have meetings were weeks that pastoral care that wasn't urgent. It wasn't somebody in the hospital, but things like people who were shut-ins. I would put those in weeks where I didn't have other meetings. My district superintendent at the time explained, Sarah, you don't have to be at every administrative meeting. I didn't like hearing that. I like to be at all of the meetings, but it did help me to be a little bit more selective about what things I needed to show up for. So now, in many cases, if you're thinking about quarter time and you're just racing through those times, you've gotten almost all the way to the hours that your pastor has that week. What does it look like to be able to reach out in mission and ministry? In those sorts of settings, the congregation really is going to need to think about, are there things they can take off the pastor's plate, ways that they can step up to help with pastoral care? And it also continues to go quickly with a half-time pastor. So if we've gone up to 10 hours with preaching and meetings and pastoral care, with quarter time, if you have a half-time pastor, so 20 to 25 hours, you have maybe a little bit more flexibility for pastoral care. You have some time to be able to build connections in the community. Maybe you can spend 5 hours a week building connections and being part of the feeding ministry and the feeding program. Well, you're very quickly at 15 hours for that week. Maybe at 50%, you might be able to have a pastor lead a Bible study or be able to teach a Sunday school class. But do you see how that time gets divided out pretty quickly? It's very important. And again, I'm talking about part-time in this video, but this is true of full-time. It's very important to be very clear about pastoral expectations. And especially if you are a pastor who is switching between percentages of appointments, you're going from one type of part-time, 25% to 50%, or 50 to 25, or let alone, as I did, going from 100% to 25% and back to 100%. Thinking intentionally about how you're using your time is very important. And if you're a member of a congregation or a staff parish relations committee, it is vital that you have communication with your pastor as well as your district superintendent around expectations. Even more so if you're an SPRC that's considering decreasing the percentage of appointment. Maybe it's because of financial pressure. Maybe you just think we don't need that many hours from a pastor. It's important to have a much longer conversation with your district superintendent than can be covered in a video, so that you have clear understandings of what impact that may have on your ministry and how the congregation is prepared to help fill any gaps so that mission and ministry can continue and be fruitful and grow. So I hope that as you wrestle with these questions, you'll have conversations again with your district superintendent, have conversations with colleagues, and I really want to encourage all of us to resist the urge to say there's no such thing as part-time ministry, not in a way that diminishes the commitment of those serving in less than full-time appointments, but in ways that help to cultivate healthy boundaries, and for us to continue to think about healthy boundaries for folks who are also in full-time ministry, so that we can maintain, again, not only the understanding that God calls us to serve and set apart ministry, but we are first and foremost beloved children of God who I do not believe God calls us to destroy ourselves or be destroyed in ministry. And by having healthy boundaries about how clergy function in local churches and in other ministries, it creates space for other people to be able to step up and to be needed to step up. Sometimes people just need to be needed to step up and to live into their call, as we are all called to minister by virtue of our baptism.